The call comes in like a routine dispatch. A woman reports that her daughter has not come home. No signs of panic in her voice, no screaming, just a fact. She's gone. This is happening in Ozark County, Missouri, in mid-July 2017. The location is remote, farmland, a few buildings, a large plot of land. The day before, emergency services had already been at this same property. Firefighters had responded to a brush fire near the house. For now, the two events are not connected. The fire was extinguished with minimal damage. The disappearance is documented as a separate incident. Rebecca Rood offers a simple explanation. She claims the girl intentionally set the fire as a distraction and then left. She emphasizes that her daughter was difficult, argued often, and refused to follow the rules. This very story becomes the basis for the initial report. Belongings are not thoroughly checked. The area is not inspected in detail. The case is classified as a runaway.
For the police, this is a standard situation. In such cases, everything begins with documenting the facts and distributing a bulletin. For now, there are no grounds for immediate suspicion. But even at this moment, there is one important nuance. The entire picture is built exclusively on the words of one person, and to understand how well it corresponds to reality, investigators will later have to rewind events. In the initial case files, everything boiled down to 3 points: conflict, fire, departure. But to understand how this could possibly align with reality, investigators had to go back and see who Savannah was before she moved to the farm. Before this, Savannah lived in Minnesota, not just visiting or in between places, but permanently. It was an environment where people had known her for years and saw her in her daily life, not through secondhand accounts.
When investigators request her personal file, they are confronted not with a history of endless scandals, but with a set of documents typical for a person with certain special needs, who was nonetheless integrated into a familiar routine. The files do indeed contain medical notes. They relate to perception, attention, reactions to stress, and how she adapted to new situations. These records do not embellish the situation or pretend there were new difficulties, but they do not indicate behavior typically associated with sudden breakdowns or abrupt disappearances. There are no incidents after which a person would cut all ties and vanish. Reports and character references show that Savannah was in school, under the care of specialists, and lived on a predictable schedule. She maintained contact with those around her. She was not falling out of her social environment. For investigators, this is an important foundation, because such details help them understand what to expect in a stressful situation and what would be considered atypical. A separate place in the file is occupied by the testimony of her adoptive mother. She describes in detail the period before the move. According to her, the idea to go to her biological mother didn't appear overnight and wasn't an impulse. Savannah had spoken about it in advance, more than once. She kept returning to the topic, asking questions, trying to understand what awaited her. The adoptive mother emphasizes that it did not look like an attempt to escape her current life. It was more like a desire to understand her past and try to build a relationship that hadn't existed before. The decision was discussed. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't accompanied by ultimatums or loud conflicts. These words are corroborated by digital footprints. Investigators review Savannah's personal accounts and posts from the weeks before the move. There is no aggression, no harsh statements, no sense that a person is preparing to sever ties. On the contrary, these posts convey excitement and a cautious hope that this new chapter might turn out differently. She writes about the journey, about the new place, about being worried, and at the same time, looking forward to change. These posts do not look like a farewell to the past. They look like preparation for an important step, one that a person is taken consciously and not alone. The move itself was also not spontaneous. It was organized, with belongings, with coordination, with discussed plans. Savannah had an understanding of where she was going and why. Such a scenario is inconsistent with the image of a person who, according to her mother, was ready to create chaos and leave without a trace at any moment. As these facts come together into a single picture, the first serious contradiction becomes apparent. The Savannah from before the farm does not look like a person on the verge of a breakdown. She strives for contact and stability, even if it doesn't come easily. This doesn't negate the difficulties, but it changes the expected model of behavior. This is where a key discrepancy emerges. The image of Savannah before the move and the image later described by her mother do not match. To understand where and under what circumstances this break occurred, investigators had to turn to the only source of information about life on the farm and carefully analyze what happened after the move. The period that follows turns out to be the most secretive in the entire story. At this stage, everything that happened to Savannah after her arrival at the new place can only be reconstructed from a single source. No neighbors, no people who might have seen her daily, no independent confirmations.
The only description of those days remains the words of Rebecca Rood, recorded in conversation with the police. In the case file, 2 dates stand side by side and would later be considered together. On July 19, 2017, firefighters respond to the Rood property in Ozark County for a brush fire. On July 20, 2017, Rebecca Rood contacts the sheriff's office to report Savannah missing. That same day, Rood gives a detailed statement. It is not a set of disjointed phrases or an emotional story. She calmly lays out the sequence of events, arranging them chronologically. This account is recorded in documents and becomes the starting point for the police's initial actions. According to Rood, Savannah was in a difficult emotional state after the fire. She claims that Savannah felt guilty about what happened and was worried about the possible consequences. According to her statement, this is what pushed Savannah to leave, without discussion, without trying to explain anything. The documents state that the departure, as described by Rood, occurred on the night of July 19 to 20. She claims that Savannah waited until the house was quiet and packed her things herself. Rood specifically emphasizes that there were no conflicts that evening. The atmosphere, she says, remained calm. Further details then appear in her testimony. Rood lists exactly what she claims Savannah took with her. The case file mentions a backpack. It allegedly contained clothing, small personal items, and a blanket that Rood calls her favorite. This detail is mentioned several times and is presented as a sign of a premeditated departure. Rood separately describes the moment itself. She says she did not hear Savannah leaving the house, did not notice the doors opening, did not see her leaving the property. In the morning, she says, the house was already empty. She does not point to any disarray or mention any signs of a struggle. On July 20, Rood gives the police a written list of items she claims disappeared along with Savannah. The list is compiled quickly and confidently. It is added to the case file without edits and becomes part of the bulletin that patrol officers will work with in the first few days. From a procedural standpoint, everything at this stage appears to be in order. There is a time frame, there is an explanation for the supposed motive, there is a list of items. There are no claims of third-party involvement. There are no indications of coercion. Formally, the elements fit into a single scenario. The report is accepted in accordance with procedure. Information about Savannah Leckie's disappearance is passed on to the county's on-duty units. The bulletin uses the description provided by Rood and the list of items compiled from her words. The search is structured based on this data. After this testimony is recorded, the story ceases to develop at the level of words. All that remains is what can be reconstructed from records, movements, and traces that do not depend on anyone's explanations. Once Rebecca Rude's version of events was officially documented, the police had only one way to move forward: to verify it, not with words, but with things that exist independently of any story. Phone activity, movements, financial trails, and any digital markers capable of showing where Savannah really was and what happened after that night. From this point on, the story begins to be filtered through facts. One of the first steps is to request data from Savannah's phone. The carrier's response logs the last connection in the vicinity of the farm. After that, the device never appears on the network again. No new calls, no messages, no reconnections. The connection is severed and never resumes. For a runaway scenario, this creates the first tension because the digital trail ends at a single point. Next, financial data is checked. Savannah's bank cards show no activity, not on the day of the disappearance, nor later. No purchases, no cash withdrawals, no attempts to use the account. For someone leaving an isolated area, this is a serious limitation. Without money, any movement quickly leaves traces, but here there are none. In parallel, her digital activity is examined. Her social media accounts remain unchanged. No logins to her accounts, no messages, no signals that could indicate contact with the outside world. Even attempts to remain anonymous usually leave minimal traces. Here, nothing appears. Attention then shifts to the roads. Ozark County is a rural area with a limited number of routes. There are few cameras, but everything available is reviewed. Footage from exits, intersections, and rare surveillance points is checked against the time windows of the night and morning after the fire. No confirmation is found that Savannah left the area on foot or by catching a ride. Separately, the police return to the list of items provided by Rude. It is compared with what actually remains in the house. The check is carried out without haste. What is confirmed is recorded. What doesn't match is set aside for re-evaluation. At this stage, no one is making bold conclusions, but the working notes are becoming more extensive. Several days pass, and the overall picture does not expand. The disappearance occurred from a remote area. After the phone's last activity, there is not a single confirmed trace of her beyond the property. Financial transactions are absent. Cameras provide no route. Patrol officers receive no information from people who are usually the first to encounter runaways. At this point, the runaway theory ceases to be supported by facts. It continues to exist formally, but it does an increasingly poor job of explaining what is happening. The investigated leads yield no results and once again lead back to a single place. This forces investigators to change their priorities. External checks are nearly exhausted. To move forward, it is necessary to focus on the farm itself and what happened within it. This shift in focus becomes the logical next step in the investigation and opens a phase where answers will be sought not outside the property, but on it. By the end of July 2017, investigators in Ozark County have fewer and fewer leads for an external search. The roads have been checked, digital trails have been checked, possible routes have been checked. All these lines lead back again and again to one place, the farm, located in a rural part of the county, far from dense housing and random witnesses. At this point, attention inevitably focuses on the people who were constantly on the property, primarily Rebecca Rude, whose report started the entire story. Before this, she was considered the reporting party and the main source of information. Now, her role changes. She becomes the person through whom they must reconstruct all the events of the final weeks. Personal data indicates that Rude was 39 years old at the time. She lived on a farm of about 81 acres. The property is isolated, with limited access and a minimal number of neighbors. Such conditions mean one thing: whatever happened on the property happened out of sight of outsiders. Rude did not live on the farm alone. Her partner, Robert Pete, was constantly there with her. His presence on the property is documented both before and after Savannah's disappearance. Despite this, his role is barely mentioned in the initial statements. He is mentioned in passing and does not figure as an active participant in the events. Rood had no steady job. Her main occupation was listed as raising animals and doing farm work on the property. This lifestyle does not raise questions in itself, but it means that Rood and Pete spent most of their time on the farm.
Their contact with the outside world was infrequent and easily traceable. Investigators check available databases. No prior recorded contacts between Rood and social services are found. There are also no formal reports from Child Protective Services or complaints from neighbors. On paper, her background appears clean and contains no alarming marks. However, it is this outward neutrality that begins to play a different role. Everything known about life on the farm comes from the two people who lived there. There are no witnesses, no independent confirmations, no third-party observations. Any reconstruction of events relies exclusively on their words. At this stage, investigators move on to gathering background information, daily routines, habits, movements, who left the property and when, who had access to the area. This does not look like pressure or an accusation. It is an attempt to understand how the stated version of events corresponds to the actual living conditions on the farm.
In parallel, they begin to analyze details that had not previously aroused interest. The isolation of the property, the complete dependence of the picture of events on the words of two people, the absence of external traces beyond the farm. Together, these factors begin to form a narrower circle of attention. By early August 2017, it becomes clear that further investigation is impossible without intensive work on the farm itself and with those who controlled what happened on its territory. Rebecca Rood and Robert Pete cease to be just the background of this story. They become the key figures through whom every day and every action preceding the disappearance must be reconstructed. This stage doesn't mean conclusions. It means a change in scale. When there are no answers beyond the property, the investigation inevitably turns inward.
It is from this moment that the work begins, no longer limited to checks and requests, but requiring a careful and systematic breakdown of what happened on the farm, step by step. As the investigation focuses on the farm, the investigator's attention shifts to the details of daily life. It is now important to understand the conditions Savannah lived in after moving and what decisions were made concerning her on a regular basis. The testimony of Robert Pete becomes a key source of information. He lived on the property the entire time and was present during the period leading up to the disappearance. His words are recorded separately and compared with what Rebecca Rood had previously reported. His testimony reveals that after the move, Savannah's familial life was completely restructured. She stopped attending school and was switched to homeschooling. This decision was permanent and sharply reduced any external contacts. Pete also mentions the phone. According to him, her device was confiscated as a punishment. Communication with the outside world was restricted, not temporarily, but on a permanent basis. Savannah had no way to independently contact anyone outside the farm. Investigators also record information about the daily work on the property. Tending to animals and farm chores took up a significant part of the day. These duties are described not as helping out, but as an established rule that could not be avoided. The testimony also mentions restrictions related to food. They are explained as matters of discipline and the farm's internal rules. The investigation records these words without judgment, cross-referencing them with other case materials. Taken together, these details form a clear picture. Savannah's life on the farm was one of complete isolation and strict control. Her education, communication, routine, and daily life were regulated by the adults living on the property. At this stage, the disappearance no longer looks like a sudden departure. It begins to be viewed in the context of an environment where independent decisions were practically impossible. This conclusion leads the investigation to the next step, a more thorough inspection of the farm property and the events of the final days before the disappearance. As the search yields no results, investigators increasingly turn their attention not to evidence, but to the behavior of Rebecca Rood. Not to what is recorded in the reports, but to her actions during the period when Savannah is officially being searched for. Rood actively posts on Facebook. She asks for help, urges people to share information, and thanks them for their responses. On the surface, it looks like she is participating in the search. The posts are shared, and comments appear beneath them. However, the content of these publications seems contradictory. In the same posts where she pleads for help, Rood simultaneously accuses Savannah of being ungrateful and having a difficult character. In effect, she publicly creates an image of a person who is to blame for her own disappearance. These formulations are not one-offs and do not seem like an emotional outburst. In parallel, questions arise about her actions outside of social media. When the possibility of a large-scale search involving volunteers is discussed, Rood refuses to grant access to the farm property. She cites private property and concern for her farm. Formally, this is permissible, and the refusal is noted without pressure. But against the backdrop of a complete lack of any traces beyond the property, this decision begins to stand out. The farm remains the key location, yet access to it is restricted. At the same time, Rood continues to insist on controlling the process and the information. Taken together, these actions create tension.
Public activity is combined with real-world restrictions. Pleas for help run parallel to attempts to keep the investigation within a framework convenient for one person. By this point, Rebecca Rood is no longer perceived as just the reporting party. Her behavior becomes a factor influencing the course of the search. This is what leads the investigation to the necessity of acting more formally and independently of her decisions, moving to a stage where control over the situation gradually moves beyond private arrangements. By early August, investigators have no doubt about one thing: it is impossible to move forward without direct access to the farm. Rebecca Rood's behavior, the absence of any traces beyond the property, and the testimony about life on the farm all form the basis for a formal step. The investigation obtains a search warrant. On August 4, 2017, officers from the Ozark County Sheriff's Department arrive at the farm. The operation is planned in advance.
The territory is large, remote, with several buildings and open areas. Dozens of officers participate in the search. Canine units are brought in. The work begins early and follows a clear plan. First, they inspect the house. The rooms are documented, personal belongings are inventoried, and attention is paid to details that were not previously checked. Then they move on to the outbuildings, barns, and pens. Each area is inspected separately, and everything is documented. Of particular interest is the area behind the house. This is where the spot Rood had previously called the site of an accidental fire is located. According to her, it was because of this fire that firefighters were called to the farm. Now, this place is viewed not as a domestic incident, but as a potential source of evidence. The burn pile is inspected with particular care. The soil is removed in layers. They work slowly to avoid damaging any potential finds.
During the inspection, small fragments of bone tissue and teeth are discovered in the trash burn pit. After this, work on the site is halted. The location of the find is immediately cordoned off. All discovered fragments are recovered, packaged, and sealed. The materials are sent to a laboratory for forensic analysis. The procedure is carried out without comment to the press and without premature statements. This discovery changes the status of the case. The disappearance is no longer considered a runaway case. The case is officially reclassified as a suspected homicide. From this moment on, the investigation moves beyond a search and enters the phase of a criminal proceeding. Now, the results of the forensic analysis and the actions of the people who controlled the territory where the discovery was made become key. They will determine the future course of the investigation and lead detectives to their next decisions.
After receiving the forensic report, the investigation closely monitors the actions of Rebecca Rood and Robert Peet. No public statements have been made yet, but the circle of possible involved parties is effectively limited. Any movements and legal steps taken by the couple are noted and analyzed as part of the process. During this period, an entry from the Missouri State Registry of Vital Records appears in the case file. Rebecca Rood and Robert Peet officially register their marriage. The procedure is done without publicity and in a short time frame. The documents are correctly filed and immediately become known to the investigation. For the investigation, this fact has legal, not personal, significance. Under state law, spouses have the right to refuse to testify against each other. This is a legal provision that is rarely used in criminal cases, but in this situation, it significantly limits the possibilities for interrogations and confrontations.
Investigators compare the marriage registration with the already established circumstances. The forensic analysis confirms the discovered fragments belong to Savannah Leckie. The farm property has been identified as the key location. The circle of people with constant access to it is minimal, and against this backdrop, a legal barrier appears between the two main figures, making it impossible to obtain mutual testimony. Almost simultaneously, another action is recorded. Rood and Peet leave the state of Missouri. The move is confirmed by official data. It is not an attempt to disappear without a trace or a clandestine departure, but the absence of both complicates any investigative actions requiring their personal presence. The investigation considers these steps in combination. First, securing legal immunity, then leaving the state's jurisdiction. Each of these actions, taken separately, is not a violation of the law. However, together they form a pattern of behavior in which the investigation's access to the key figures becomes significantly restricted. It is separately noted that at the time of their departure, neither Rood nor Peet makes any attempt to cooperate with the investigation. Contact with law enforcement representatives is minimal and formal in nature. All previously stated versions of events remain without further confirmation. Based on the materials already collected, the forensic report, and an analysis of the couple's actions, the investigation makes a procedural decision. The behavior of Rood and Peet is classified as an attempt to obstruct justice. Taking into account their control over the farm property and the role of each, arrest warrants are issued for both on suspicion of murder and concealment of evidence. After this, the investigation is no longer limited to gathering information. The documents now contain specific accusatory language, dates, and instructions.
The next stage involves the arrests, interstate procedures, and the first official interrogations that will determine the future development of this case. After the warrants are issued, Rebecca Rood and Robert Peet are arrested separately. The first few hours pass without substantive testimony. Peet answers formally and avoids details. His position changes after he is informed of the forensic results and the current status of the case. After that, he agrees to a full interrogation. The interrogation is conducted officially and recorded according to established procedure. Peet speaks in a reserved manner without emotional commentary. He describes life on the farm after Savannah's move. According to him, Rood's control intensified gradually.
At first, it seemed like strict rules, then like constant pressure that eventually escalated into openly cruel measures. The transcript reflects specific episodes.
Pete claims that the punishments were humiliating and had nothing to do with discipline or upbringing. Savannah was forced to perform difficult and humiliating chores on the property, subjected to cold water, and then had substances that cause intense burning applied to her damaged skin. These actions were repeated and, over time, became a habitual method of control for Rood. Pete emphasizes that what was happening was not isolated outbursts. According to him, it was all systematic. Restrictions, humiliation, and physical pressure were applied regularly. He admits that he made no attempt to stop what was happening and did not seek help, explaining it as fear and complete financial and domestic dependence on Rood. Investigators clarify the conditions of isolation. Pete confirms that Savannah had almost no contact with the outside world. Communication was controlled. Movements were restricted to the farm property. Any disagreement was seen as a reason for another punishment.
A motive also appears in his testimony. According to Pete, Rood quickly stopped seeing Savannah as a family member. Living together caused her irritation and anger. The punishments stopped being a way to maintain order and became an outlet for her accumulated aggression. At some point, he claims, the situation spiraled completely out of control. Pete's testimony is compared with the materials already collected. The forensic data, the conditions of isolation, Rood's behavior after Savannah's disappearance, and her attempts to limit the investigation all fall into a single sequence. His words explain why what happened on the farm remained hidden for so long and why attempts were later made to destroy the evidence. The investigation establishes the fact of prolonged cruel treatment. This is a conclusion based on the totality of testimony and evidence. The motive for the concealment becomes obvious. This was not about a single incident, but about an attempt to hide a prolonged period of what had been happening on the farm. After Pete's interrogation, the investigation moves on to verifying his words and reconstructing the precise timeline of the final days. This stage will become the basis for further charges and will determine the role each participant played in this story. In early August 2017, Rebecca Rood is brought in for questioning at the Ozark County Investigative Unit. By this point, the investigation already has the forensic results and the recorded testimony of Robert Pete. The conversation is structured around specific episodes, dates, and actions that had not previously been explained. The interrogation is videotaped. In the first few minutes, Rood maintains a reserved demeanor. She speaks about the difficult situation on the farm and her strained relationship with Savannah, trying not to go into detail.
Her answers remain general and do not go beyond her previously stated accounts. After being presented with some of the case materials, Rood offers a new version of events. She claims to have found Savannah on the farm property with no signs of life. According to her, she concluded that Savannah had taken her own life and acted in a state of extreme stress. This version is recorded for the first time during this interrogation and had not appeared in the case file before. The record reflects her explanation for her subsequent actions. Rood speaks of a fear of public condemnation and potential investigations by social services. She claims this was the reason for her attempt to get rid of evidence of the incident, to avoid drawing attention to the living conditions on the farm. The investigators move on to clarifying questions. They're interested in the exact time of discovery, the sequence of events, and discrepancies with already established facts. Rood's answers prove to be inconsistent. She describes the same events in different ways. These discrepancies are noted in the interrogation record. The new version is compared with Pete's testimony and the forensic results. His account of prolonged abuse and Savannah's complete isolation is inconsistent with the claim of a sudden and unexpected outcome. The nature of the discovered fragments also does not support the scenario described by Rood. Her behavior after Savannah's disappearance is analyzed separately. First, the story of a runaway, then the account of an accidental fire, and now an explanation involving panic and fear of inspections. Each new explanation emerges after the previous version no longer aligns with the established facts. Following the interrogation, the investigation notes the implausibility of the suicide version. It is not supported by Pete's testimony, forensic evidence, or the logic of the events. Another recorded contradiction appears in the case file. At this stage, the prosecution proceeds from the assumption that what happened on the farm was not accidental. The body of evidence points to deliberate actions and a subsequent cover-up. Further steps in the investigation will focus on consolidating this position and preparing the case for trial. After Rebecca Rood's interrogation, the investigative team no longer uses her explanations in its work. All versions she voiced during the interview are recorded in the transcript, but further actions are not based on her oral testimony. The reason for this is the identified contradictions and the evidence already collected, which do not fit with the versions she presented. The focus shifts to actions Rood took before and independent of the interrogations, those steps that cannot be altered or fabricated after the fact. In early August 2017, the previously seized electronic devices and financial documents are sent for separate examination. The procedures are launched in parallel with the issuance of official requests and the ordering of forensic analyses. The digital forensic examination begins by documenting the storage media, the time of seizure, and the state of the memory. Computer forensic specialists recover the user activity history. Search queries, browser activity sequences, and saved data are analyzed. The report details queries related to methods of destroying biological traces and the use of chemical substances for their removal. The phrasing is specific and practical. The timestamps point to the period before Savannah's disappearance, as well as the days immediately following it. It is noted separately that the search for this information began in advance. These actions do not coincide in time with the interrogations or the emergence of official suspicion. The results of the examination are compiled into a separate report and added to the case file without any commentary or interpretation. In parallel, a review of financial transactions is conducted. Bank statements and government benefit payments are analyzed. The investigation establishes that the benefits registered to Savannah continued to be received after her disappearance. The payments were not stopped, and no notification of a change in circumstances was sent. Financial records show the regular receipt of funds over the following weeks. The money was used in the usual manner. This fact is documented in a separate memorandum and added to the case file as an independent piece of evidence. The digital and financial data are compared with Robert Pete's testimony and the versions previously offered by Rood. The search for information on concealing evidence, the continuation of benefit payments, and the successive changes in her story form a single timeline of actions. These elements are corroborated by independent sources and do not contradict one another. The digital forensics and financial review reports form the basis of the evidentiary case. This evidence is independent of confessions, retractions of testimony, or new versions of events. They document specific actions taken at specific times. After these documents are added to the file, the theory of spontaneous decisions is no longer used in the working materials. The body of data indicates planning and a subsequent cover-up, as well as the presence of a financial motive. At this stage, the evidentiary base is considered established, and further procedural steps become a matter of formalization rather than fact-finding. After the digital and financial evidence is added to the case, Robert Pete's position changes. The volume of evidence presented by the investigation makes his previous course of action untenable.
In the presence of his attorney, he agrees to cooperate with the prosecution.
His status in the case is clarified, and his testimony is recorded in accordance with procedure. Pete gives a detailed account of the events that took place on the farm. His testimony is formally recorded and accompanied by an audio recording. He claims that Rebecca Rood gave Savannah an excessive amount of hydrocodone. According to him, Savannah's condition deteriorated sharply afterward, and she became unresponsive. Pete then describes his own actions. He admits that at Rood's direction, he participated in moving the remains and destroying them on the property. This process, he says, took several days. He explains this as an attempt to hide what had happened and buy time while the runaway story was being formulated. Pete's testimony contains specific details. He points out locations on the property, the sequence of actions, and time frames. This information is cross-referenced with the search results, forensic data, and digital evidence.
No significant discrepancies with the already established facts are found. Pete separately emphasizes the distribution of roles. He asserts that Rood made the key decisions, and his involvement was limited to carrying out her instructions. This point is noted by the investigation and checked for consistency with other case materials. Pete's testimony connects the previously disparate elements. It supplements the digital and financial evidence and provides a direct description of what happened on the farm. The versions provided by Rood during her interrogations are no longer used in the investigation and remain only as part of the official record. Based on the totality of the evidence, the prosecution finalizes the indictment. The case file records the conclusion of premeditated actions and a systematic cover-up of the incident. The next stage of this story will unfold in court. By the time the interrogations are complete and all key testimony has been obtained, the investigative team proceeds to reconstruct the precise sequence of events. The explanations of the parties involved are no longer considered foundational. Only verifiable facts remain in use, supported by documents, forensic analyses, and independent sources. The investigation separately examines what data allows the events to be tied to a timeline. The investigation relies on Robert Pete's testimony, the results of toxicological studies, digital traces from seized devices, and records related to movements on the property. These sources are cross-referenced and independently verified, without relying on the versions that emerged after the arrests. During this review, it is established that the decisive event occurred on July 18, 2017. This day is considered the point after which the situation became irreversible.
Everything that happened afterward belongs to a separate period and spans the next several days. The reconstruction is built hour by hour. It is established that during the day, Rebecca Rood administered a previously prescribed medication to Savannah. Experts note that the permissible dosage was exceeded. Pete's testimony and medical data indicate a sharp deterioration in Savannah's condition. At that moment, no one contacted doctors or emergency services. No outside help was summoned. The investigation then details the actions taken after the critical moment. Based on the totality of the evidence, it is established that Savannah was no longer given any assistance. After some time, she is moved from the house to a more remote part of the property, to a location previously used for burning trash and organic waste. The events spanning several days are examined as a separate block. The investigation concludes that the attempts to dispose of the evidence were not a one-time reaction.
Accelerants and whatever was on hand were used. The repetitive nature of the actions and the choice of location indicate that what was happening was deliberate. The result of the reconstruction is a clear division of time periods. July 18, 2017 is considered the day of the key action, and everything that happened later is recorded as the period of concealment and destruction of evidence. This framework is formalized as an official timeline and added to the case file. The assembled picture contains no gaps in time or logical breaks. Each step is confirmed either by testimony, forensic results, or digital data. In this form, the reconstruction is handed over to the prosecutor's office and becomes the basis for further procedural decisions. After the indictment is approved, the case file is sent to the court of Ozark County, Missouri. By this point, there are no longer disparate versions in the case.
The prosecution's file contains Robert Pete's testimony, forensic reports, digital data, financial documents, and the day-by-day, hour-by-hour reconstructed timeline of events. It is in this form that the story is first examined in open court. The court hearings proceed in a routine manner. Interrogation transcripts, expert conclusions, and sworn testimony are read aloud in the courtroom. The court systematically examines the chain of events, starting from the key day and ending with the subsequent period of attempts to conceal what happened. Each assertion is compared with documents and technical data. As the materials are reviewed, the positions of the parties become predictable. The explanations Rebecca Rood had given previously are compared with the forensic findings and Pete's testimony. These versions are recorded in the case file but find no corroboration. The discrepancies between her words and the established facts are reflected in the court records. After consulting with her attorneys, Rood agrees to a plea deal. She pleads guilty to charges related to murder and the subsequent concealment of the crime. This decision is formalized in court and accepted by the judge, which allows for the exclusion of harsher penalties provided for by state law. Robert Pete's role is considered separately. The court takes into account his cooperation with the investigation, his admission of participating in the cover-up, and the testimony that formed the basis of the prosecution's case. His actions are classified as accessory after the fact, without him being recognized as the instigator. At the conclusion of the trial, a sentence is handed down. Rebecca Rood is sentenced to life in prison and sent to a Missouri State Correctional Facility to serve her sentence. Robert Pete receives a 4-year prison sentence and is sent to a state prison for those convicted of concealment and being an accessory. The sentence codifies all the conclusions reached during the proceedings. The timeline reconstructed by the investigation becomes the official version of events, established by the court's decision. The story that began with a missing person report ends with specific sentences, specific institutions, and legally binding decisions. After the sentence takes effect, the case of Savannah Leckie extends beyond the court records. It continues to exist in agency reports and the public statements of those connected to the story. Savannah's adoptive mother gives several interviews to regional media. She talks about Savannah before her move to the farm, and this image sharply contrasts with the version Rebecca Rood had presented to the police and others for months. For those who knew Savannah before, the story of her taking her own life seemed dubious from the start. The Ozark County Sheriff's Office issues a final statement.
It emphasizes that such cases often begin with a formulaic report and remain out of focus for a long time when all information comes from a single adult. Within the department, this case is recorded as an example of the vulnerability inherent in such situations. The farm where the events took place is sold within the next year. The buildings are dismantled, and the property changes hands. The place disappears from the daily life of the county, but it remains in archival materials and investigation documents. The court established that Rebecca Rood had complete control over Savannah Leckie's life and systematically concealed what was happening. Her guilt was confirmed by the totality of the evidence, Robert Pete's testimony, and her confession recorded in the court materials. Some details were never reconstructed with complete accuracy. Savannah's final hours are known only through circumstantial evidence and the words of an accomplice. These gaps are reflected in the case file.
The story of Savannah Leckie is legally concluded, but the case is recorded as an example of what happens when a version of events is accepted without fact-checking.